Good afternoon. I say good afternoon because it's the early afternoon where I am, here in my home office in Costa Rica. Of course, I don't know what time it will be when you will watch this recording. But my name is Dennis Petri. I am the International Director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom. I am also the founder and scholar at large of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America, and I am a professor in international relations at the Latin American University of Science and Technology in Costa Rica, and I'm also the chair of humanities of that university. And it's really a pleasure to be able to join you in this asynchronous format. But I'm convinced, I'm sure that we will have very interesting discussions around these presentations. And I very much look forward also to watching the other presentations that are part of the panel on religious freedom convened by Professor Wolfgang Hede and Professor Christoph Sauer, and I really would like to thank them for all the effort they put into organizing this panel. So I very much look forward to the other presentations and to also reading your papers. So my paper is on the title "Restrictions on Mission in Indigenous Communities in Latin America." And a subtitle is Exploration of Political, Legal and Missiological Implications. Now, I must clarify from the outset that I am a political scientist by training. I also did some research in the realm of political philosophy. My doctorate actually is in political philosophy, but my main field of research is empirical research from the perspective of political science and more specifically comparative politics. So I am not a missiologist, but I will try to venture into some interdisciplinary explorations, including missiology in this paper. And so this paper is basically a spin-off of my PhD dissertation that I defended in 2020, May 2020, which is titled The Specific Vulnerability of Religious Minorities. And it has been published by the International Institute for Religious Freedom in 2021 as a book, and it's accessible for free in digital format on our website, www.iirf.global, and you can click on books. And it will show up there. And if you would like a physical copy, then please reach out to us, and we will be more than happy to mail it to you. Okay, but this my dissertation basically is my answer to all those people that claim there is no religious persecution in Latin America. And what I explain in my dissertation is that religious freedom is a multi-dimensional concept. That means that there are many different expressions of violations of religious freedom, and a number of those are also applicable to Latin America, but they are unfortunately not very visible and not very much talked about, and therefore the impression exists that there is no religious persecution in Latin America, and specifically no persecution of Christians in Latin America. And part of the confusion, of course, is related to the fact that Latin America is a majority Christian continent. And so the question is, well, how can there be persecution of Christians in a majority Christian continent? But certainly there is, and in my book I explored that further. And I do that through a number of case studies that each highlight different manifestations of religious freedom violations in Latin America. But one of those case studies specifically looks at the indigenous communities and religious freedom violations in those communities. And so the community where I did field work is the Nasa community, the Nasa tribe, which is one of the largest indigenous communities in Colombia, and they're mostly located in the southwestern highlands of the country, in and around the department of Cali and Huila. Really in deep in the jungle of Colombia. Okay, now and so in my dissertation, I look in this case study. I look at the religious freedom violations against this indigenous community from a broad, religious freedom perspective. And as I said, religious freedom has many different dimensions. I will specifically focus now in this paper on the dimension of missions, proselytism, or evangelism. By the way, Christoph Sauer pointed out to me that it's the convention now in missiology to speak of mission in singular instead of missions. Because mission refers to essentially missio Dei, God's mission, and Christian activity, Christian participation in God's mission, and so that's why there's just one mission. But from a political science perspective, there are obviously restrictions on mission, and those are essentially also restrictions, one type of restrictions on religious freedom. That's what I will focus on. And so just to give you a general context, in the 1990s, a movement started to take power, social movement, very strong social movement started to become very influential in Latin America, called indigenismo. Basically it was a combination of different social movements that demanded the recognition of the cultural rights of the indigenous communities. And as you will recall from world history, of course, Latin America was colonized after Christopher Columbus arrived and discovered the Americas in 1492, shortly after the Spanish and then the Portuguese, and then in North America, other European nations conquered the American continent and submitted the indigenous peoples. And that submission has been experienced as, of course, as something very, very negative, as something very harmful, and as something that has essentially destroyed much of indigenous culture, and also indigenous traditions and indigenous traditional religions, because many of those indigenous peoples were forced to convert to Catholicism, essentially. So much of the historic, political, social, cultural traditions and systems of those indigenous communities then disappeared or were under a very strong threat. And the policy of basically eradicating the indigenous heritage of Latin America actually continued well after independence, but it also led to a counter reaction. So as I said, in the 1990s and even before, there was this movement called indigenismo that was demanding the recognition of group rights and ethnic determination. And this was also picked up by international institutions. So a very important milestone was 1989, when the International Labour Organization adopted Convention 169 concerning indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries. And this convention was very influential because it formally recognized the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples, among other things. And then several international documents also at the level of the United Nations, but also at the level of the Organization of American States, followed suit. And what happened as a result is that many countries in Latin America granted indigenous communities far-reaching self-determination rights. So indigenous communities, of course, did not become independent. They continued to be part of the nations, of the states that they were part of. but they were granted self-government rights within the borders of their own territories, which are called reserves in the United States, and they go by different names in Latin America. Resguardo is the name that was adopted in the case of Colombia. In those territories, they were allowed to establish their own self-government system, including the right to have their own jurisdiction and to have basically a far-reaching protection of their rights. I also would like to make a point on the inherent tension between two different conceptions of religious freedom, because that is also at the core of these kind of issues. Of course, the indigenismo movement sees the protection of indigenous rights and self-government rights, etc., as a way, as I said, to correct historical injustice, but also as a way to preserve their religious freedom. And in a very real way, any new religion, especially Western religions, because that's what Christianity is perceived to be, although it's technically not a Western religion, but it's coming from the Middle East, but it's definitely foreign historically to the Latin American continent. And so it's seen as an imperial imposition, Catholic colonial imposition, or but also an evangelical North American imposition, because many of the converts to Christianity today are actually evangelicals that were introduced to the evangelical faith by North American missionaries, and so that is really their perspective, and it goes even further, and this is what really makes it very complicated, because of course there is a huge problem in the conceptualization of religious freedom, because under the indigenous worldview, actually the land, the territory, is also their sanctuary, their temple, their church, so to speak, and therefore, if a new religion, a Christian church, is established on the land, then it is as if a Buddhist shrine would have been placed in a Christian church, right? It's very similar in that respect, and so there is that is of course a different perspective, and there's no easy way to find a solution for this situation. And of course, the perspective of Christian converts and of missionaries is totally different. It's much more Western, and is much more focused on, and as is actually also part of the evangelical faith, on an individual choice, an individual decision, much more than a collective cultural decision. But there's this clash between individual rights and cultural rights, or collective rights from human rights perspective. But it is also something that really plays a role in these kinds of conflicts. These contending conceptions, understandings of religious freedom. Now, finally, I would like to say a few words on possible solutions to overcome these issues, and this may be a little bit controversial, but just first looking at the possible political legal reforms, well, there clearly is an issue. On paper, there should not be an issue, because even though indigenous communities have been granted self-government rights, they should still adhere to the national constitutional norms of the rule of law, and also the human rights declarations, and so that is, of course, the solution. The solution is already provided, and it basically says also in the Colombian constitution, and the same is true for the Mexican constitutions and other arrangements in other countries in the region, is that any self-government mechanism cannot go against human rights, and therefore also not against religious freedom. But of course the problem is when judges and the jurisprudence of the Colombian Constitutional Court that I reviewed, but also of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, clearly shows that whenever there is a conflict between the preservation of the cultural rights and self-government rights of indigenous communities on the one hand and religious freedom on the other hand, it's the religious freedom of the new converts that ends up losing. And so I think clearly these rights are out of balance, and this is something that that should be addressed in a comprehensive way, and it's also related to the fact that most of the focus is on the protection of the indigenous communities against external threats, against states, against imperialists, against multinationals, against environmental disasters. All those things are very important, but not enough attention is given to the internal dimension of indigenous self-determination rights, because that, by definition, also should take into consideration the rights of minorities within the minority, right? And that would include also the position of converts to Christianity. And those converts, very clearly, that came forward in my field research, they state that they want to remain indigenous. And so when they're told, well, if you convert to Christianity, you're no longer indigenous, that is, of course, not how they see it. That's why I also ended up identifying them as cultural rejectionists, in the sense that they want to remain indigenous, they want to remain in their territories, but they just want to have the possibility to adopt another faith, right? So those are some political legal issues that we can explore. But in terms of missiological shifts, and I want to end with that, I found basically two things. The first thing is that the missionaries that evangelize these indigenous communities are often very uncompromising, very radical, and they teach the new converts to basically radically break with what is viewed as pagan indigenous traditions, and of course. That is very understandable from a pure interpretation of biblical teachings, but it does create a context in which really social relations are distorted, and so, of course, in missiology, there's this concept of contextual ministry that is often referred to, and that is certainly a concept that should be explored in relation to these contexts, and especially the question whether it is possible for new converts to Christianity to somehow continue to stay to remain involved in indigenous traditions, even though some of them might be considered pagan. And this is not an easy question to solve, but there is certainly a very important, it's certainly a very important aspect to look into, because of all the important consequences that it has, right? If relations between traditional indigenous peoples and Christian indigenous groups become so tense and violent, well, then there's probably no room anymore for the gospel. And that is also what I've identified in my research, is that without judging in any way, but I came to the conclusion that many of the converts within the community lacked social wisdom, in the sense that they were very antagonistic, very confrontational, and that attitude is also not conducive to peace and not even to a Christian witness. I don't have the answers to address this. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts about this. But yeah, this is the overview I can give you about my paper in the 20 minutes that I was given. I very much look forward to meeting you. Thank you.